The topic of what is consciousness has long eluded humans, as has a real concept of free will. And don't get me started on the issues of trying to stay calm and not be angry or stressed at the world, even when the only thing we have to blame is ourselves. It was Einstein who reminded us that no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. So it's never a bad time to dig into emotional intelligence and resilience, learning how we can regulate ourselves in high-stress situations and unpacking what the hell these constructs are that we label as negative emotions. On the show today to help me with all of this is none other than Dr. Stephen Porges. He is undoubtedly your favorite psychologist's favorite psychologist. If you were to look into the bookshelves of the best psychologists around the planet, I'll bet you they have some of his work. A piece of feedback I had from anyone that has met him or worked with him is that he is the most incredibly relaxing and easy person to talk to, which is something I also found to be 100% correct. I interviewed him on the show a month ago to talk about Polyvagal Theory and how the body perceives threat. To say that we might have gotten off track would be an understatement. But it was a brilliant conversation on practicing curiosity and building inner peace and acceptance within ourselves. There was, however, a second part of the conversation I am releasing today that is its own neatly confined, much less tangent-prone episode. We followed a logical set of inquiries into free will, how we make choices, the duality between the body's pain systems and emotion systems that make us feel that we are who we are, and how we can take the lessons for building free will into stressful situations and build resilience through a greater emotional intelligence. And we did it all in less than 20 minutes. I do find when you talk to PhDs who have spent a lifetime deeply engrossed in their field, you can find some of them seem to speak in very theoretical, almost different languages that are full of abstract concepts that don't seem to translate into real life in the slightest. But I loved Stephen's ability to take his hugely advanced knowledge and talk about it in such a relatable way as he does today. And I'm confident this short episode is going to have a few ideas that will really stick with you. So hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset Psychology podcast, digging into the science of self-improvement and the philosophy of a life well lived. As Eckhart Tolle said, trying to become a good or better human being sounds like a commendable and high-minded thing to do. Yet it is an endeavor you cannot ultimately succeed in unless there is a shift in consciousness. So let's talk about consciousness. Welcome to the show, Stephen. I have long been fascinated by the topic of consciousness, and you've done an extensive amount of research into the fundamental sources of wonderful experiences such as our intuition, how our neuroception builds awareness of the environment around us and can affect our physiology and our psychological state. So from this, I'm wondering what your personal opinions are on the topic of free will. Where does the soul end and our nervous system begin?
Okay, I'll give you thoughts, but I'm going to give you, there's a person by the name of Viktor Frankl. I'm not sure you've run across Viktor Frankl. He was a Holocaust survivor. But he has some concepts that are very overlapping with polyvagal theory. So polyvagal theory says we have stimuli and we have responses, but in between we have the organism. And that's our physiological state. And when our physiological state is, let's say, more resilient, calmer, then the stimulus produces different responses. But what Frankl says, the space between stimulus and response is where free will exists. Now, let's put that into polyvagal terms. It means I react to a stimulus, meaning I get a physiological reaction, but it doesn't mean that I have an overt behavioral. So I can be triggered, I feel my physiology, and then I can become aware, and this is interoception, because the signal, the stimulus, triggers reflexively what I call neuroception, but we're not aware until our viscera reacts. Now, my viscera reacts, and in general, what we do when our body gives our response, we try to create a narrative that justifies often an aggressive behavior. And what Frankl is saying, which I agree with, is I acknowledge my body responded, but now I reflect on what I will do with that information. So it's like, let's say your partner says something and you get triggered by it, you get a physiological response. Or you say something to your partner and the partner basically looks aside, doesn't engage you, and you feel this reaction of why are you not responding to me? And the answer is, yeah, that's that visceral response. It's hardwired because they haven't been contingent with you. But now I have a choice. Am I aggressive, or do I say, look, I hope you heard me, but this is can you be more gentle in the engagement without creating a tight narrative that justifies your, let's say, need to literally act. So people often act out when they get triggered. And the answer is, yeah, but can you feel when your body is changing, and can you take that space? And that space is where free will is. So the part is we need to separate our hardwired reflexes from our own intentional behaviors. And what we end up doing is blurring them. We use the hardwired reflexes to co-opt the intentional behavior. So that is a polyvagal interpretation of how free will can exist.
I love it.
The other part, which you're really trying to reach for in your more obtuse question, is that there are levels of the nervous system, and then people get into the notion, where is consciousness? Where's free will? Is it a cortical phenomenon? And then you get to people who talk about extracorporeal sources of energy. And that is not so odd or kinky, because we are always confronted with rhythms from the environment, from rhythms that infect our nervous system. But we don't know. We don't have enough information to know all about what our receptors are in our nervous system. What are we really detecting? So it's like people who get headaches when there are storm fronts coming. Not everyone gets headaches, but storm fronts change barometric pressure, and some people have greater sensitivity to that, and that sensitivity is a trigger to their physiology. Similarly with earthquakes, and many animals will with tsunamis, they'll go to high land, they'll anticipate this before it comes. But they're picking up some other, let's use the term energetic, but most likely it's slow wave patterns of the ocean and the barometric pressure that their bodies are sensitive to. We may be sensitive to it, but we just don't know it. We don't have a language for it. We don't measure it.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, don't have enough time to dig into all of that. But one, that was really cool. Two, the concept that the space between your stimulus and response is free will. Really like that as an explanation. I did like the Vipassana 10-day meditation, and it's mostly, you're meditating for an hour, but it's a lot of it is just the pain that you experience and realizing you don't have to react to the pain, and building that space between to then be like, I have this internal bodily sensation. I have this anger response, but actually, is that going to lead me to my path that I want? Probably not. Is there a different path? You're basically building yourself free will, if that's what it is.
That's the same metaphor. Yeah.
It's interesting.
And when we start, so chronic pain, which is actually interesting I've been involved with think tanks on chronic pain, and they have actually, many of the pain physicians and pain psychologists have adopted a type of polyvagal perspective, which is if your physiology is calmer, you deal better with the pain. It's when you're like this, when you're tense and frightened, it's the sympathetic nervous system that is supporting the defensiveness, and pain is a defensive signal. So when our muscles relax, the chronic pain tends to be dissipated, or at least becomes manageable.
Makes lots of sense. Like, it's interesting, people that have more difficulties with their emotions, like sort of borderline, can also have more issues with then dealing with pain and other things because they don't know how to control their emotions. But is that related?
Yeah. So let's stick with that for a moment. When you use the term difficulty with their emotions, what you're really saying is they live in negative emotions and high valence or high activity negative emotionality. When you say difficulty, you're saying they don't spend much time in pleasant, or let's say pleasant emotions, or well-regulated social behaviors or social interactions. So we know who these people are, and we know their physiology in general is tense. Their bodies are defensive, and their emotions are, I don't even like to use the word emotion because it's a higher level psychological construct that lives on top of a physiological state of threat.
Mm.
So if we think of positive emotion, that's living on top of a physiological state that supports homeostasis. My body is safe enough to enable me to enjoy interacting and experiences. When my physiology is disrupted, now it doesn't give me permission to explore these positive experiences. So I can, even though emotion's up there, it's really based upon this lower physiological systems.
Fascinating. So how would you help them exactly in terms of if they're trying to regulate themselves better and be more in emotions that they would enjoy?
Okay, so this we're going full circle because we started with a comment, something like that, which is about agency. How do we control? And it all starts with an awareness of what's going inside our body. And then it's not how do I control it? It's really how do I develop a strategy that enables me to deal with what's happening in my body. So if I'm aware that my body's moving into a state of threat, what will be my strategy? Go to a quiet room, to leave the situation, to go for a walk, to take a few deep breaths, to go to the restroom, get a drink of water, to mobilize my body. And so as opposed to do I tell my body to sit still and to inhibit these reactions. And it's the latter we tend to do because they're part of our social context. We don't want to service our body. We want to service our social community, even though our faces may grimace and we may pick up our cell phone and start texting out of anxiety, as opposed to engaging the person who's talking. So we have to become aware of the strategies that we use to enable our body to function more optimally.
Yeah, that makes lots of sense. You definitely see people either resisting their body or feeling like they don't want to resist their bodies and refusing to sort of listen to people telling them to find ways to calm down or like breathe. They're like, no, I should feel these emotions. And then it's like, well, is that actually going to help?
Well, there are two parts. There are two parts. So on the negative side, if the body starts feeling under threat, the way of adapting in a social context in general has been, I don't feel my body anymore. And so we start finding that many people don't have bodily feelings. If you ask them how they feel, they don't have any words for it because they can't relate to that question. They might feel pain sometimes, but they can't tell you how they feel. It's just not in their vocabulary. And the part is, so they've learned strategies. And in fact, trauma history plays into this a lot. And a lot of people have trauma histories. And that is you learn not to react to your body. And then you start getting all this constellation or tapestry of what used to be called psychosomatic problems, of stress disorders, for no better term right now. But basically, our autonomic nervous system is not listening to the organs. It's just saying, I'm not regulating anymore. So now you have irritable bowel syndrome, you have arrhythmias, you have fibromyalgia, you have migraines, you have eczema, you have all these things. Your body is just, the feedback loops just aren't working anymore. When do the feedback loops stop working? When we no longer are, basically, we start teaching our body how to monitor itself by not listening to our own physiology, not acknowledging it, not being aware of it.
Yeah, interesting. I listened to an episode of you on a podcast where you're talking about IBS and some responses, and I have experienced, since I broke my leg, some IBS when I do really extreme physical activities, but I don't think we have time. Sadly, we didn't have time to discuss that. But I am now fascinated by the idea I might have developed IBS in response to extreme physical situations as partly some internal self-sabotage and perhaps general stress response. But we did have time for listener questions on resilience and handling high stress coming up after a short break. I do have one question from a listener that I did promise I would ask you. So I feel bad if I don't, but I think you maybe have semi-answered it, just like a slightly different flavor. But he's a healthcare provider. He's a pediatrician and often has some trauma patients. He was just asking, when you're dealing with patients day in, day out, you need to be in your ventral vagal state and very calm to be able to build rapport with people. But he can find that really difficult when you're dealing with lots of stress and workload. Often he's pushed to like more fight and flight, internal physiology, and wondering what you would advise on helping regulate yourself in those sorts of settings where you're surrounded by people that would be the opposite of how you should be co-regulating.
Let me start with an example. After the Hamas incident in Israel, I did a couple of podcasts with Israeli psychotherapists who were trying to deal with basically hostage families and other people who are going on. But I realized after talking to the therapist for a few minutes that there was something very powerful going on. The therapists themselves were in a state of both fear and anger at the same time. And their bodies were just broadcasting this. And so this is now going to relate to the pediatrician. I had to explain to them they could not be an effective therapist when their body was in that state. So they had to develop strategies with their colleagues to co-regulate each other, whether they had to reduce the number of hours of seeing clients or they had time to talk to each other, go for a walk, to, in a sense, calm their bodies down using social engagement with another or just walking in a safe place. So the issue was that your pediatrician friend, the issue is he's under basically threat. In a sense, metaphorically, it's not the same as what was going on in southern part of Israel, but physiologically, his body is in a state of threat. And that physiology is now being broadcast to his clients. So the first point he has to understand is in that state, his effectiveness as a clinician is compromised because part of a pediatrician's basically toolkit is to enable the child to feel safe and comfortable. And that has to be in terms of his physical presence, his voice, and how he engages the parent and the child.
Well, this is still a good answer. He's actually a podiatrist, not a pediatrician, which I always think is funny how close those words are. And I always mess it up. So that was my fault, not your fault, I think.
Okay, so he is working with feet. Okay, I got that one right. So the issue is if he feels like he is, in a sense, burnt out, dealing with the problems of others and pain of others, which is really the common point, right? He has to realize that if he feels burnt out, he's no longer an effective clinician. He may think he is, but the ability to hold the space and to be present with a patient is important, whether we're talking about mental or physical health. And patients have to feel comfortable and safe with their providers. And providers have to understand that in fact, teachers as well, how they broadcast their physiological state affects the student or affects the client.
Yeah.
So the intervention is he needs to create with colleagues or some situation where he can take a break and he can regulate his physiology either through movement, through breathing, through moments of just quiet or, taking a drink. But he has to understand that his body is screaming. His body wants to be calm.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much. It's been delightful to talk to you. So thanks for being such a curious guest and interested in my stupid questions.
Oh, your questions are good and your curiosity is good. I'd say just follow your curiosity. It's going to bring you nice places. I could say that my curiosity has enabled me to see the world in ways that I didn't expect to be able to see it in.
Yeah. Congrats on coming up with such cool theories that genuinely are impacting people's lives around the planet. Well done because I definitely, when I was in science, I was very much felt loads of people just so disconnected from the actual end result.
Well, as I said, the greatest frustration of my life being an academic was the thought that my ideas would not translate into the world. Well, listen, thank you so much for inviting me and
you're welcome.
Wishing you the best. Enjoyed it.
What a legend. Truly a delight to have such a special human being on the show. His ideas on free will and the fact that negative emotions are simply a psychological construct sitting on top of a physiological state did really resonate with me and gave me some big ideas I had to take some time to digest. The episode I wrote on how to build free will that blew up on YouTube, I can say was directly inspired by this conversation with him. So I'm sure there are some ideas worth you ruminating on. Then if you want to help the show out and give yourself a reason to talk about the concepts in this episode, you could share it with a friend and then possibly debate your psychological constructs sitting on top of your physiological states with complete free will. Or you can book a free call with me on Wednesday afternoons where I have only 2 slots available for the first listeners who take them to discuss whatever you want. If you feel like generously joining the premium membership, you can also ask questions for upcoming guests, as well as asking me anything and generally supporting the show in return for ad-free listening. And on that, have a great weekend and make it your mission to make someone calmer today. There is enough stress in the world. Thank you so much for listening.
Go you!
Your consistency to reach the end of an episode is legendary.
My hero!
But when we learn things, it's important to reflect. So I politely invite you to take a pause, rifle through the biggest ideas you just heard. So here's your opportunity to hit pause and have a think. Okay, did you wrestle with some insights? Information doesn't stick when we race from one podcast to the next without using our brain to play with the knowledge. So here's another go at a pause. Alrighty, I'll let you off to continue with your life now. If you have any ideas or feedback for the show, I'm always interested to hear from you.
You're the best!
And other than that, please stay curious. Curious. Quote. Smiling for no reason.